And indeed, her garden was admirably suited for meditation and self-communion, as I can testify, for I have been in it. Together with some friends who were as eager as myself to look on the famous retreat, I set out once, uninvited, to risk a visit. We rode up the slope of the Mount of Olives. Unexpected luck attended our venture. Miriam of Migdal was not at home. She had gone that day, as she so often did, to the temple courts to listen from morn till evening to the disputations of the scholars. We were received by a young man who, as it transpired later, was her brother. His extraordinary length was topped by a face the like of which I have never encountered elsewhere. The cheeks were incredibly drawn out, but they were irradiated by a queer smile of kindliness. One might have said an idiotic smile. But what was it? Simplicity or goodness? At first I had the feeling that his mind was not wholly developed, for he did not cease to smile all the time he talked, and he seemed gratified to be able to do whatever we, complete strangers to him, suggested. I assured myself later that it was pure simplicity, of a kind which may be met with frequently enough among country folk in Judea, and even more in Galilee. He did not once ask us who we were and what business we had in the place, but made humble obeisance and besought us to enter. He brought us basins of water and towels to wash our feet, though they happened to be well encased in sandals. He washed our hands, and, as is the custom among them in the receiving of visitors, approached to kiss us. Within, the house was scrupulously clean and simple. There was nothing that hinted at the great house in the city. We saw only the barest and most necessary of furnishings, 2 mattresses of woven straw on the hard earthen floor, 2 cushions and covers disposed in the corners and partly shut off by screens of bamboo wood, a low table, 2 small mattresses by its side, and then a few clay or woven vessels and gourd bottles, a few jars, 2 large urns, some wooden boards, all homely work, in which they kept their daily supplies of bread, cheese, sour milk. As in every poor house, the stone oven was so built that its smoke did not escape by the roof, but poured out through the open door. Door and window were draped with curtains of woven straw. The man bade us sit and asked us to be at ease, but I could not shake off the strange impression he had made on me. He spoke slowly and with frequent pauses, as though both his organs and his impulses were dull with heaviness, but at the same time his gentle smile and humble demeanor seemed to beg forgiveness for his labored speech and motion. I soon discovered that this dullness did not proceed from a defect in his mental growth. It was the result of a certain inner quietude. For later, when he conducted us through the garden with all its complicated plants, he displayed both intelligence and knowledge. And yet at first the undisturbed faith which possessed him made me feel that he lacked something and was unable to grasp and analyze simple things and incidents. It was a curious and eerie effect, as though I had before me not a man with will and nerves, but rather a strange phlegmatic animal. The same strangeness, I would even say the same hint of death, rested on the whole peaceful house, for one would have believed, from the quiet, from the severe cleanliness and order which reigned in it, that only the dead dwelt here. Yet this was by no means the impression which one carried away from his sister Miriam, or from the young girl Martha, whom he now called into the room. For the latter, in spite of her obvious nervousness and distress at our unexpected visit, retained enough vanity to throw a glance at her face in the urn of water as she hastened toward us. But he remained, with all his humility and submissiveness, as distant as if he belonged to another world. He was just as remote from us and from this world when he led us through the garden. He was interested in what he was telling us, and yet completely indifferent. We saw him standing before us, pointing to one object after another, speaking to us, seeing his surroundings, touching them with his hands, and yet he was not there. He was elsewhere, as though he had been partially awakened from a dream which was his real life. There was, moreover, a disturbing congruence between his mood and the spirit of the garden. I had never seen such varieties of flora. I had not known that so many existed. It was not a garden of plants and flowers, but a necropolis of petrified foliage and colour in the likeness of creeping things, animals and limbs of unknown creatures. In Judea, one becomes accustomed to the sight of new growths, plants and vegetables not encountered in other lands, because of the stringent ritualistic prescriptions which surround the preparation of meat dishes. The Jews rely largely for their food on the produce of their gardens. Hence, they have developed unusual varieties of plants. One finds here melons and artichokes in forms and sizes never encountered elsewhere. They have a sort of apple melon which they call casus, and which resembles an animal climbing on the leaves. The surrounding leaves are hard and black like old leather and set with wild tongues. The fruit is a mixture, half flower, half fruit, with a strong taste of mint, which burns the tongue. There is also the artichoke, which they call caneres. This is not a vegetable, but a kind of cactus with the claws of a wildcat. Under the claws lie pouches of magic powder which attracts insects on which the plant feeds by sucking out their juice. There are in this land rooted growths which are more animal than plant, and yet everything that I had seen till then in Judea was as nothing compared to the contents of the garden. On a sloping terrace in the shadow of dark cypresses there stretched 4 trellised lanes of plants. On this side, close to the entrance, lay 4 flower beds. One was a blaze of red poppies, such as are common in Judea only in the springtime. The second was a harmony of picked blue hyacinths, their heads hanging down in close clusters. The third was a bed of tremulous lilies of the valley, and the fourth a lane of violet irises. The 4 colors, Miriam's brother explained to us, represented the 4 elements of the creation: earth, air, fire, and sea. This, as I recalled, was a repetition of the symbolic coloring on the strange Babylonian curtain, which, according to young Hanan's account, covered the entrance to the sanctuary of the temple, and which was woven in hyacinth, byssus, scarlet, and purple. Between the 4 beds and the trellises in the shadow of the cypresses lay the actual garden of spices, or, as I have called it, the necropolis of petrified or enchanted creatures, a field of fantastic figures, gaping mouths, contorted limbs, convulsive tendrils, black tongues, and protruding swords, a confusion of heavy colors, close-locked and oppressive, from deepest violet to fieriest red. Side by side were beds of dragon flowers like tangles of worms, beds of irises which held in their pistils captive flowers like butterflies, beds of carnations fast asleep in their stamens, beds of narcissus, beds of cumin and sharp peppermint, bushes of mild bluish lavender and stinging, intoxicating ginger, nutmeg bushes and branches of saffron, cinnamon plants with tiny distilled tongues. Scattered through all of these were countless field flowers. There was not only a harmony of color, but an almost visible exhalation of aromatic mists. What I have described till now covers familiar names, the flora of all gardens. When we passed beyond these beds, we came upon incredible eruptions of form and color on twisted, root-like shapes, pointed and prehensile, which caught at our clothes and arrested our progress. These were the exotic plants which had been brought from remote places in the wilderness, such as the sharp-smelling helbona and lebona, which are used in the temple services. They came from Syria and were dried and ground into incense. Now I saw where Miriam of Migdal obtained the odorous herbs which she burned in the metal and earthen censers scattered through the rooms of her house. We saw in her garden plants, which in form and color were replicas of the severed limbs of man and beast, a flaming red coxcomb, the erect ear of an ass, noses thrust up sensitively from the soil, trembling, one would have said, with inhaled and exhaled air. There were crippled plants which brought forth no flower, but consisted of fungus and naked, crooked roots reaching out with unearthly hands, fists, and fingers as if in dumb prayer. I could have sworn that there went up from them a bitter lamentation, as if they were the earth-bound reincarnations of the accursed dead imploring release. And all these plants, flowers, thorns, and cacti, familiar and unfamiliar, from the homely flower of the field to the remotest blossom of the desert, were there to yield up their hidden essences for the unguents and perfumes of Miriam of Migdal.